When I was 28, my marriage to Jessica, who was 26 at the time, came to an abrupt and painful end. It's been 2 months since we finalized the divorce, but it still feels raw. Jessica had been cheating on me with my younger brother, Daniel, or Dan, as everyone calls him. And to make matters worse, she ended up pregnant with his child. I guess you could say the writing was on the wall long before I caught on, but 4 months ago, when she announced her pregnancy, everything started to unravel. At first, Jessica swore up and down the baby was mine. She even teared up when she told me, acting like it was this beautiful moment for us to share. But Dan's constant visits made me suspicious, even though I tried to push the doubts out of my mind at first. One night, those doubts wouldn't let me rest. Something about Dan's behavior, the way he'd linger around Jessica or place his hand on her belly like it was the most natural thing in the world, gnawed at me. Jessica would brush it off, saying I was overthinking or being insecure. Still, the uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. Finally, I decided to check her phone while she was asleep. Part of me didn't want to find anything, but deep down, I already knew the truth. And there it was, messages between her and Dan, confirming everything I feared. They weren't just having an affair. They'd been together for a while, and the baby she was carrying? It wasn't mine. It was his. When I confronted Jessica the next morning, she tried to deny it at first, spinning some story about how I misunderstood. But I had all the proof I needed, and eventually, she admitted to everything. She and Dan had been sneaking around for months, and she'd planned to keep me in the dark until after the baby was born. Their grand plan was to break the news then, get a divorce, and start their new life together, living comfortably off the child support they expected me to pay. That was the end of our 2-year marriage, and honestly, I should have seen it coming. Looking back, it feels like this betrayal was just the final nail in the coffin of a life that had been falling apart for years. You see, my relationship with my family had always been rocky at best. My parents, Robert and Linda, made it clear from an early age that Dan was the favorite. He could do no wrong, while I was always the one who had to prove myself, or worse, clean up his messes. The clearest example of this was the day I received my college acceptance letter. I remember walking into the house, full of excitement, only to realize there was a party happening. At first, I thought maybe they were celebrating my big news, but then I saw the cake. It was for Dan. They had thrown him a party instead of acknowledging my achievement. When I asked why, my parents told me they didn't want Dan to feel left out and that I should focus on supporting him instead of being selfish. That moment broke something inside me. That very day, I decided I was done with them. I packed my things and left the moment I turned 18. From then on, I was on my own. I worked my way through college, taking out loans and juggling part-time jobs to make ends meet. After graduation, I rented a small apartment with a friend and started building my life from the ground up. My parents never reached out to me, and honestly, I didn't expect them to. Years went by, and I thought I had finally put that chapter of my life behind me. Then, last year, Dan contacted me out of the blue. He said Mom and Dad missed me and wanted to reconnect. At the time, I was married to Jessica, and life was comfortable. I thought I'd moved on, but deep down, I knew I still carried the weight of what had happened with my family. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet them. Our first meeting was awkward, to say the least. It felt like I was sitting across from strangers, rather than the people who had raised me. But they seemed to be making an effort to mend things, so I figured I should try, too. Slowly, we started seeing each other more often. I even invited them to my home, which turned out to be a huge mistake. That's when Dan met Jessica. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Dan was charming, and Jessica was polite. It seemed innocent enough. Little did I know, their connection was anything but innocent. Before long, Dan started visiting more often. He'd come over under the pretense of wanting to spend time with me, but it became clear he was really there for Jessica. They'd exchange glances when they thought I wasn't looking, and the way they interacted started to make me uncomfortable. Still, I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I told myself I was being paranoid. But when Jessica announced her pregnancy and Dan's visits became even more frequent, I couldn't ignore the red flags any longer. The moment I found those texts, everything fell apart. Not only had they been sneaking around behind my back, but they'd also mapped out a future that excluded me entirely, except, of course, for my wallet. It was like I'd been blindsided by the very people I thought I could trust. And when the truth came out, my parents didn't hesitate to take their side. Mom and Dad made it clear they supported Dan and Jessica, brushing off what they'd done to me as if it were nothing. It felt like I was being betrayed all over again, not just by Jessica but by my entire family. It turns out all those sweet words from my family about treating me and Dan equally were just empty promises. When Jessica and Dan announced our divorce on social media and shared the news of their engagement, my family didn't just accept it, they celebrated it. They showered them with support and kind words, as if they'd done something noble instead of tearing my life apart. No one cared about the damage they'd done to my mental health or how they destroyed any trust one had left in people. It wasn't just that Jessica had been cheating on me for months. It was the fact that she had spent 6 whole months lying to my face, making me believe the baby was mine. Losing her was painful enough, but realizing I'd also lost the child I thought was my own, that was a pain I wouldn't wish on anyone. When I turned to my parents for some semblance of support, they dismissed my pain entirely. They told me this was for the best, that I should be happy for Jessica and Dan. Happy? For them? It felt like a slap in the face. They didn't even pretend that what Dan had done to me was wrong. Instead, they urged me to join the celebrations. That was the final straw for me. I cut them out of my life once again, just like I had when I left home years ago. But this time, their interference made things even worse. Jessica walked away from the divorce with a hefty settlement and my car. Thanks to my parents siding with her and Dan, her lawyer spun some story about how I was toxic and controlling, forcing her to quit her job when it had been her decision all along. My parents didn't just back her up, they went so far as to tell the court that they had cut me off years ago because of my so-called misogynistic attitude and temper tantrums. With their testimony against me, I didn't stand a chance. The evidence was stacked against me, and I lost a significant amount of money. The only silver lining was that I got to keep the house, which at least gave me some sense of stability after everything fell apart. When the divorce was finalized, I felt an odd mix of relief and exhaustion. I was just glad it was over. Thankfully, where I live, there's no mandatory waiting period for divorces, and Jessica didn't contest it, so I was able to wrap it all up quickly. All I wanted was to move on and never have to deal with Jessica, Dan, or my parents ever again. Forgetting about everything was easier said than done, but I threw myself into work. It was the only way I knew how to cope. I worked harder than I ever had before, determined to bury the memories of this nightmare as deep as I could. Eventually, my efforts paid off. 2 weeks ago, I got a big promotion. It came with a better title, a bigger paycheck, and even an upgraded company car. It felt like a fresh start, and for the first time in a long time, I was genuinely happy. To celebrate, I decided to treat myself to a solo dinner at one of my favorite restaurants. I couldn't help but post about it online. It was a small way to share my happiness with the world. But that turned out to be a mistake. A day or two later, my mother reached out. She sent me a message asking me to come visit them. I was stunned. After everything that had happened, the divorce, their blatant support of Jessica and Dan, I couldn't imagine what they wanted from me now. I ignored her message, hoping she'd get the hint, but she didn't. Instead, she started calling me nonstop. When I didn't pick up, she decided to show up at my office. The scene she caused was embarrassing, to say the least. She got into an argument with my receptionist and refused to leave until I agreed to see her. To get her out of my office, I promised I'd visit in a few days. That seemed to satisfy her, and she finally left, but I could feel the tension bubbling inside me. I didn't want to see her, or any of them, but I also didn't want her showing up at my workplace again. A few days later, I reluctantly made the visit. My parents had moved into a larger house, one that could accommodate the baby Jessica had just given birth to 3 weeks earlier. It didn't take a genius to figure out that the settlement money I'd paid was funding their new lifestyle. Honestly, though, it didn't bother me much. By this point, the alimony was a relatively small portion of my salary, and I could afford it without much trouble. When I arrived, Dan wasn't home, and Jessica was asleep, so it was just me and my parents. I didn't bother with pleasantries. I sat down, waited, and let the silence drag on until my dad finally blurted out the reason they'd called me. Dan had lost his job, and apparently, the settlement money and alimony weren't enough to keep their household afloat anymore. They admitted they'd seen my post about the promotion and hoped I could help out. I was speechless. My parents retired years ago. Dan was unemployed. Jessica wasn't planning on going back to work anytime soon, and now there was a newborn in the picture. Of course, they were running low on money. But the audacity of it all, after everything they'd done to me, was something I couldn't wrap my head around. How could they even think it was okay to ask me for help? I was so stunned by what my father said that, for a good few minutes, I couldn't even respond. I just stood there, letting the words sink in, before it finally hit me. I didn't owe them anything, not after everything they'd done to me. Without saying a word, I got up and walked straight to the door. I could hear my parents calling after me, begging me to stay and hear them out, but I kept moving. When I opened the door to leave, I found Dan standing right outside. He looked startled to see me, probably because he wasn't expecting me to be there, let alone storming out. My parents were still trying to convince me to stay, but I ignored all of them and stepped out into the pouring rain. The rain was coming down hard, soaking me to the bone as I made my way to my car parked just outside their lawn. By then, my frustration was boiling over. Between the storm, my drenched clothes, and their audacity to ask me for help after everything, I was already in a foul mood. Then, as if to test my patience even further, they followed me outside. I was fishing around in my pockets for my keys when I heard Dan's voice. This time, it was him doing the pleading. I'll admit, it was strange to see Dan, of all people, swallowing his pride and asking me for help. He'd always been smug and self-assured, a product of the golden child treatment my parents had lavished on him his entire life. Watching him stand there in the rain, practically groveling, it was clear that things really were as bad as they'd made them sound. It must have taken a lot for them to convince Dan to step down from his pedestal and beg me for anything. But instead of feeling sympathy, I felt something else, anger. I snapped. "Leave me the hell alone," I told them, my voice shaking with rage. "If you're really that desperate for money, why don't you try begging strangers on the street? They'd probably have more pity for you than I do." With that, I got into my car, slammed the door shut, and drove off, leaving them standing there in the rain. I won't lie, it felt pretty damn satisfying in the moment. After a lifetime of being mistreated and overlooked, it was almost cathartic to watch them face the consequences of their actions. But now, 2 days later, I'm not so sure I did the right thing. My mother has been texting me non-stop, piling on the guilt. Part of me wonders if I should help them out. I mean, I have enough money that giving them a little wouldn't hurt me financially. But every time I think about it, it feels like they're just using me again, taking advantage of my success without caring about the pain they've caused. I can't shake the feeling that helping them would only prove that they can walk all over me whenever they want. Eventually, I decided to put my foot down. I told my mom to stop contacting me, or I'd get my lawyers involved. I didn't want to go that far, but I was tired of her relentless pestering. Unsurprisingly, that didn't sit well with them. A few days later, Dan showed up at my house, uninvited, to talk. The conversation started civil enough, if you could call it that, but it quickly went downhill. He said he felt sorry for the way I'd been treated growing up, but then followed it up with something so ridiculous I couldn't believe it. He told me, with a straight face, that he couldn't help being inherently better than me, and that was why our parents treated him differently. Then he had the audacity to suggest that I was the one being immature for holding grudges. He even said I should stop acting weird toward our parents and just help them out since they were struggling. I couldn't help it. I laughed in his face. "Do you even hear yourself?" I asked, shaking my head. "Instead of standing here trying to guilt-trip me, maybe you should be out looking for a job. You know, like an adult." That struck a nerve. His smug facade cracked, and he started yelling. He accused me of being jealous of him, of our parents' favoritism, even of Jessica. He claimed I was only refusing to help because I wanted revenge for the fact that everyone preferred him over me. At that point, I couldn't even take him seriously. "You're absolutely right," I told him deadpan. "This is all about revenge, and guess what? There's not a damn thing you can do about it." That seemed to push him over the edge. He stormed out, but not before warning me that he'd come after me and force me to hand over the money somehow. I didn't even bother to argue. Let him try. Dan's all talk and no action, and we both know it. Honestly, I'm not worried. He can huff and puff all he wants, but at the end of the day, there's nothing he can do to me. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm in control, and there's no way I'm letting him, or anyone else in my so-called family, take that away from me. Update 2. 3 days ago, Dan showed up at my house again, probably thinking he could convince me to change my mind. Spoiler alert, he failed. My parents had already tried the same thing, and that didn't work out for them either. I thought they'd finally take the hint and leave me alone, but I underestimated just how persistent and entitled they all are. This time, they sent Jessica to do their dirty work. She called me out of the blue, and at first, I didn't want to answer. I knew it would be more of the same. Guilt trips, fake sympathy, and empty promises. But then I figured if I didn't take the call, she might show up at my door like my mother had, and I wasn't about to deal with another public scene. So, reluctantly, I answered. Her tone was calm and polite at first, which almost made me laugh. She started off by acknowledging that she understood why I wouldn't want to help them. She even admitted that, after everything they'd put me through, I had no obligation to lift a finger for any of them. But then she quickly pivoted, asking me to be the bigger person and think about helping out anyway. Jessica tried to play the sympathy card, reminding me that my parents had paid for everything while I was growing up and that she had done her best to be a good wife. I couldn't believe her nerve. My parents didn't pay for everything in my childhood. They ignored me and poured all their attention into Dan. And Jessica? Sure, she was a great wife. If you ignored the part where she cheated on me with my own brother. Needless to say, her little speech didn't work. I told her flat out that I wasn't going to help. I even pointed out that I was already spending enough on her undeserved alimony, which she had only managed to secure by lying and painting me as some kind of monster during the divorce. I reminded her that she and my family had no issue throwing me under the bus to get what they wanted, so she shouldn't expect me to feel bad for her now. That's when the tears started. Jessica began sobbing, calling me selfish and heartless. The irony of her words wasn't lost on me. I stayed firm, refusing to budge. Then she said something that honestly didn't surprise me but still made my blood boil. She told me Dan was right about me and that I'd left her no choice but to get the law involved. She threatened to go back to court and demand a higher alimony payment, claiming I'd humiliated her and abandoned her family. At that moment, I realized something. I wasn't scared of her threats. The first time around, during the initial divorce proceedings, I was so emotionally drained that I hadn't even bothered to fight back. I let her and my family spin their lies about me being toxic and controlling. I didn't contest anything. I just wanted it to be over. But now I was ready. If Jessica wanted a fight, I'd give her one she wouldn't forget. Update 3. True to her word, Jessica actually filed for a higher alimony payment, citing my recent promotion as justification. This time, though, I wasn't about to roll over and let her win. I decided to fight back with everything I had. The first thing I did was reach out to our mutual friends. I told them everything about the affair, the lies, and the way Jessica and my family had treated me. Most of them had no idea about the real reason for our separation. They were shocked and disgusted when they heard the full story, and many of them offered to testify on my behalf if it came to that. It felt good to have people in my corner for once. I also spoke to my lawyer and told him I wanted to end the alimony arrangement altogether. Jessica didn't deserve a single penny from me, and I was determined to make that clear in court. My lawyer agreed and said we'd need strong evidence to make it happen. So, over the next few days, I gathered everything I could. I dug up old messages, emails, and any documentation I could find that highlighted my family's toxic behavior. I even reached out to some of my cousins who had witnessed firsthand how my parents treated me as a kid. We'd never been particularly close, but they were kind enough to agree to speak on my behalf. They knew I wasn't exaggerating when I said I'd been treated like an outsider in my own family. Piece by piece, I built my case. By the time I handed everything over to my lawyer, he was impressed. He told me we had a solid case and that we might not only stop Jessica from getting more alimony, but also end the payments altogether. For the first time in years, I felt like I had the upper hand. I wasn't just defending myself. I was finally standing up to these people who had taken so much from me and expected me to just keep giving. This time, there would be no sympathy, no second chances, and no hesitation. Jessica and my so-called family wanted to push me? Fine. Let them. I was ready to show them just how wrong they were about me. It was already public knowledge that Jessica had cheated on me, but the way she spun the story was what truly grated on my nerves. She painted herself as the victim, me as the villain, and Dan as the so-called hero who had rescued her from a miserable life with me. The lies were elaborate, designed to protect her image while tarnishing mine. During the divorce, I didn't fight back. I was too emotionally drained to set the record straight. But this time, I was ready, and I wasn't going to let them get away with it. When we went to court, I presented everything I had. I showed several video testimonials from friends and even a few relatives who backed me up, proving that Jessica's claims and my family's narrative were complete fabrications. They had no idea what hit them. It was clear they had walked in expecting me to roll over like I had before, but they couldn't have been more wrong. The years of pain and betrayal had hardened me. Whatever emotional fragility I had once shown was long gone, replaced by a determination to finally stand up for myself. When the judge ruled in my favor yesterday, declaring that I was no longer obligated to pay Jessica any alimony, I felt like the happiest man alive. The relief was indescribable. Watching my family squirm as their lies unraveled was the cherry on top. The smug expressions they wore so confidently were wiped clean, replaced by shock and humiliation. And Jessica? She looked like she was on the verge of tears. But honestly, I couldn't bring myself to care. Her crocodile tears meant nothing to me now. As I left the courthouse, I thought about how far I'd come. This chapter of my life was finally over, and I could focus on the future without the weight of Jessica and my toxic family dragging me down. I decided to celebrate with some great takeout and a good movie. It was the first time in years I felt free, and I wasn't going to let anyone ruin it. But, of course, my family wasn't about to let me enjoy my happiness in peace. As I approached my house, I noticed Dan's car parked outside. Confused, I pulled into the driveway, only to find my entire family standing by my front door, blocking my way inside. I stopped in my tracks, utterly baffled. For a moment, I didn't even know what to say. Then I decided to act like their presence didn't bother me. "Get off my property," I said flatly, "or I'm calling the cops." My dad stepped forward, his face red with anger. "You should be ashamed of yourself for what you did today," he spat. He launched into a tirade, accusing me of being irresponsible and betraying my family by refusing to help them when they needed me most. His words dripped with condescension, as if he still believed I owed them something. I didn't respond. I refused to give him, or any of them, the satisfaction of seeing me upset. I just stood there silently, letting him rant. I could tell it was frustrating them. They had clearly come here hoping for a fight, expecting me to lose my temper and do something stupid, but I wasn't about to fall into their trap. When my mom demanded that I show respect and speak to my father, I stayed quiet. My silence only seemed to make them angrier. They yelled and gestured wildly, but I remained calm, unmoved. Then, suddenly, Dan snapped. He stormed toward me, grabbed me by the collar, and looked like he was about to take a swing. Before he could, my dad stepped in and pulled him back. "You're nothing but a jealous loser," Dan shouted, his voice trembling with rage. "You'll never amount to anything." I couldn't help but laugh. The irony of hearing those words from an unemployed man living with his parents and begging his brother for money wasn't lost on me. "Right," I said with a smirk, coming from the guy who has nothing better to do than leech off everyone around him. "Good one, Dan." That seemed to hit a nerve, and I could see the fury in his eyes. But before he could react, I took a step back. "I'll say it one more time," I said firmly. "Get off my property, or I'm calling the cops. And considering how broke you all are, I'd suggest you run before you add legal fees to your problems." Grudgingly, they left, though not without one last-ditch effort from my mom to guilt me into handing over some cash. She tried every tactic in the book, shaming, pleading, even tears, but I didn't budge. Eventually, they realized I wasn't going to cave, and they drove off. It's been almost a day since that encounter, and for the first time in a long time, my phone has been blissfully silent. No calls, no texts, no surprise visits. I can only hope it stays this way. For once, I feel like I've finally put them behind me. I don't know what the future holds, but at least now, I can move forward without them dragging me down. Thanks for watching. Rate the story in the comments. Subscribe to the channel